Welcome to another hobby. I'm Austin, and today's hobby is some more game development. Only this time, it's some personal game development for a JRPG I've been working on for a while. It's not anything I feel like I'm going to realistically get completed in maybe ever, but it's just something I have fun with. And what you're looking at here is iteration of a character concept for that game. The left one is the one I started with, and it turned out to be a little too generic. The middle one I liked, but not necessarily for this character. And the one on the right is the most recent kind of rough draft of what this character is going to look like. So what I worked on this week was trying to figure out a workflow for making character sprites. What I'm going for with this RPG is Suikoden 2 Spiritual Successor. I want this game to evoke the feeling I get personally, that nostalgic feeling I get when I play Suikoden 2. And I'm hoping to get that not only just with the overall kind of more political style plot, lots of characters and fleshed out world, but also with the kind of general tone of the visuals. So I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out how I want the things to look in the end. And what you can see here is I've got some older sprites that I've done a while ago as just kind of some quick tests. I did a prototype in Unreal, getting a character running around. The character here is actually made using a 3D model with really flat colors on it. I then rendered out all of the frames of animation into 2D and then shrunk them down so that they'd be more pixelated, and I was planning on using that as a base to work off of to do some pixel art character sprites. But that's fairly time consuming, and I don't know that it helps a whole lot because I'd have to make all of the characters in 3D first. But I still might use something similar to do just the basis. As long as all the characters kind of have the same proportions, I could probably use something like that to create a template to work off of and then draw all of the character sprites on top of that. But anyway, what I started doing here was I made a file that had a bunch of different sprite sizes, and I decided to try using a sprite, which I'm not super familiar with, but I wanted to play around with it and try out some of the pixel art tools it has. So for this one I started with the biggest sprite and tried just doing a straight up pixel art sprite from scratch just to see how long it would take. The main thing I was trying to do with this project this week was to find a workflow that captures the feeling I want, that nostalgic feeling that kind of evokes Suikoden 2, while also being quick enough that I could hopefully do a lot of sprites by myself. And this first one definitely isn't that. It ends up way too detailed, and I spend way too long on it. If you look at the clock in the bottom right, you can see how long I spent. I think in the end it took me from 2:30 to 4, so about an hour and a half to do this whole sprite, which isn't really workable considering I'd have to do 4 directions and at least like 3 frames of animation for each direction. So multiply that by an hour and a half and by how many sprites I'd have to do for the full game, and it would just be way too much work, way too much time. But for this one, I just consider it like a first step in the process. It's getting me a general sense of all of the shapes I'm going to need to create and some of the challenges that I'm going to have to face to make this sprite, which will give me a general sense of how much work each sprite is going to take as I go. And it gives me a sense of how many colors I'm going to need, especially if it's going to be a pixel art sprite. It's giving me a sense of how many shades each color should have. You know, the base shade, how many steps down into a darker shade, how many steps up into a highlight. But for this one, I just put too much detail in, too many steps, too many colors, too many folds in the sleeves, etc. For this next test, I wanted to try doing something just hand-drawn, not pixel art, that I could then shrink down into pixel art if I wanted, while still trying to capture the kind of general feeling and style of those earlier sprites, like the Suikoden 2 games had. So this one, I knew it was going to take me a long time to do because it was going to be higher detail. It ended up taking me about 2 hours, I think, to get this whole thing done. And I knew it wasn't going to be the final process I'd be using for doing these sprites, but I consider it more research and information gathering to figure out what steps take time and why, and what things I might be able to cut out. So for this one I just did basic line art as I would any normal drawing, just trying to kind of capture the top-down sprite look as best I could, and then I put in some pretty basic solid colors. Still did a lot of levels of shading, I think maybe even more than I did with the first Sprite one, and then I went back over the line work after and colored it so that it wouldn't be just harsh black outlines. It would have kind of softer edges and in bright spots, and I think it turned out good. I would like for the game to have sprites this detailed and nice looking, but it's just way too much work. So I'll let this one play out. You can see how it turned out. Then I'll come back in and describe what I tried to do with shrinking this down to smaller sprite sizes and doing some other tests. Okay, so after getting some sleep in, I decided to try shrinking this guy down to a couple different sprite sizes just to see how it looked. They ended up a little bit blurry, looking a little bit too much like I just shrunk down a high detail drawing into a smaller sprite size. I might be able to get better results trying out some different settings with how Photoshop shrinks things down. I was just using bilinear sharp to shrink it down so that it would preserve some of the detail, but I could maybe get better results using nearest neighbor or something else. But I figured the results I was getting, there was just too much detail muddying up the image when I shrunk it down, and it wasn't really worth trying to go in and fix it all pixel art style. So I decided to try something else. I decided to try an actual workflow, something actually quick. You can see I used a base mesh that I got from a Humble Bundle and just took a screenshot of it in Blender to get some better proportions. Turned out I was actually pretty close to that already with the one I did freehand, but I decided to try out this base mesh just as a more concrete base to work from. And then, so for this one, I started by roughing out the basic shape of the character really quick with line art, and then just painting in really big blocky solid shapes, putting in some really quick shading. Just doing that part took about half an hour or so, and then I wanted to shrink it down to sprite size, make it pixelated, and I cleaned that sprite up to make a nice looking pixel sprite, and that added another 10 minutes or so onto it. Still not quite as quick as I'd like, but getting closer. And also the sprite is just a little bit too simple for my tastes, so I decided to try another one. For this last one, I decided I wanted to try something that kind of met in the middle between the last two. So I wanted to do line art on it that hopefully would shrink down well enough to give me some kind of darker edges, a little bit more contrast on the final sprite, because the last one I did, just being solid colors, felt a little bit flat and like it might blend in too much with the background if it didn't have any outlines to give it some contrast to stand out. So for this one I wanted to do quick line art, and then similar to the last one, just put in only a very few solid colors, a little bit of shading, and keeping it really simple. Not many folds in the clothes, no nose or mouth or anything on the character. The legs just basically almost one solid dark color rather than having any lightness to it. And the hope was that if I shrunk this down, it being a very low amount of detail wouldn't take a whole lot to fix it up in the pixel art. So doing this again took about half an hour, about the same amount of time as doing the last one, which is good. But fixing up the pixel art took another half an hour, which was much longer than the last one. It ended up looking nicer in the end, but I think the problem is starting big and shrinking it down just leaves too much work for cleanup. So I think I got to a pretty good place here. Still not totally decided on my workflow. I have a bit more to go still, figuring a few things out. But yeah, this is as far as I got this week on it. I think most likely what I'm going to do for the next step is try doing this same basic process of doing outlines, filling it in with broad colors, a little bit of shading, except I'm going to try starting at sprite size in a sprite and seeing if I can increase the speed of the workflow by not doing it large and shrinking it down, but just starting at the smaller size, and to see if I can still work quickly in pixel art rather than the usual full-size art that I'm used to working in. It'll probably be a little bit slower trying to get the lines down without them looking bad, but I think overall it'll probably go fairly quick compared to this last one I did. Maybe I'll make a video for that when I get to it, but for now, this is as far as I got. Thanks for watching me explore another hobby. I hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe if that's the kind of thing you want to do, and have a good one.